Welcome to Good Faith Reads. I'm your host, Cliff Vaughn at Good Faith Media. Good Faith Reads is a podcast in which we focus on our book authors at Good Faith Media. We've published a considerable library of titles under our Nurturing Faith book imprint, and we invite you to check them out at goodfaithmedia.org/bookstore. Today's guests are Allan Boesak and Wendell Griffen, authors of Parables, Politics, and Prophetic Faith, Hope and Perseverance in Times of Peril. Dr. Boesak joins us from South Africa and Judge Griffen from Arkansas. Dr. Boesak, Judge Griffen, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Thank you so much.
A standard question we ask authors on Good Faith Reads: tell our listeners in a few sentences what the book is about. Dr. Boesak, let's start with you. What's the elevator pitch for the book?
This book is about thinking of how critical it is to read the Bible as a piece of dynamite for the situation in which we are today. I'm constantly amazed at how powerful the biblical message is for our situation today, and what we have done in picking passages from the Bible and dealing with them as parables for their time in that situation, and then asking what does it mean in our context. And it blows the top of all obfuscation and all the nonsense that politicians talk, and that some preachers always sometimes also talk, and it brings us very, very close to what sort of a face-to-face with the biblical message for our time. And that's what I thought we set out to do, and I think that Judge Griffen and I got that right.
So, Judge Griffen, why is the book so relevant now in particular?
The things that are driving our public discourse now are covered in this book. Even though the book was written, we've started writing it in 2020, just after the George Floyd incident. And so whether you're talking about the issues of Israel and Gaza, or the issues of democracy and the United States, or the issues of war and peace across the world, or the issues of climate justice, or the way income disparities around the world, we address those issues as if we had been looking at them today, even though we were writing this, collaborating about it years ago. And so the book is timely, even though we didn't know at the time that we were discussing it, that we were going to be actually on time or ahead of time.
Y'all write in the epilogue, quote, "We hope readers will reimagine the religion of Jesus as a moral and ethical commentary on how humans use and abuse power." So each of you, please say more about Jesus's witness vis-a-vis power, and maybe add violence to this. Dr. Boesak, could we start with you talking about Jesus, power, violence?
Well, Jesus is at the center of our theological thinking, and the way Jesus deals with power. Now, his power can also be described as the power of the powerlessness, because he's born in occupied Palestine, in occupied Galilee, born to poor parents, an oppressed, brutalized society in first century Palestine, occupied by the Romans. And yet the first time he actually opens his mouth is the scene that Luke describes in chapter 4 in the synagogue in Nazareth, and where Jesus proclaims his mission, why he has come into the world. And here is this man who is one of the voiceless in society. He is amongst his own people. He is not regarded as anyone with a particular parentage, because there's doubts about the situation of his father, and his mom was a young child from a poor community, and people use that against him. You can see that throughout the gospel. And yet, when he opens his mouth, he speaks with such authority and such power that the elites in Jerusalem begin to worry about him, that Pontius Pilate begins to worry about him, that the Roman Empire can see. So that is the difference between the power Jesus has and the power that they exercise. Or their power is the power of militarism and oppression and exploitation and brutalization and violence. Jesus' power is a power that stems out of his love for God's people on earth. He is so authentic that people are drawn to him by the power of his words and by the power of his example and what he does when he meets people and the emotions he evokes and the agency he evokes in them when he speaks. And those with the so-called power who sits with the soldiers and all of that, they don't have that. And so for me, the power of authenticity, the power of authority that Jesus exudes, that is grounded in the love that he has, which he thinks and believes comes from the anointing that he got from God, which he mentions. That is, I think, the way we should think about power and authority and power and persuasion and power and love in the world today. And that is what I find. That's one of the things that attracts me. And so when Jesus talks politics, because of the love and because of the authority and because of the authentic relationship between him and the people he stands for and fights for, that relationship brings a totally new dynamic in the whole, not just the whole conversation, but in the way people then respond to him and to their situation of oppression.
Thank you. Judge Griffen, same question. Jesus, power, violence.
The whole issue of Jesus' power and violence can be summed up in one word: empire. And in our book, I believe Dr. Boesak and I addressed this issue of empire from its various perspectives and the violence of empire as opposed to the compassionate power of love, unconditional love, in the face of empire, over against imperial violence, and actually operating within the sphere of imperial violence as an opposing force and also as a critique of empire. And to that point, the way that the religion of God, the love of God, has been, if I may say so, bastardized by the powers that be, the religious powers that be, in service to empire. And we see this very much going on now in the United States in very real ways, and it has so much impact about how we are going to be living, not only in the next few years, but how we have been living in the United States and around the world for the last actually generation.
When you bring empire into the discussion, I'm reminded, and I'm not exactly sure why I'm making this connection, but it was a light bulb moment for me in the book. Y'all wrote that when we talk about people, we sometimes call them unfortunate, and it's not just that they're unfortunate, they're also wronged, I think was the word you used in the book, which was it shouldn't be a light bulb moment for me, but it was. And I think it's an important distinction to make because we sometimes talk about the unfortunate or the less fortunate, but there's a wrongness that has happened. Judge Griffen, would you talk about that for a moment? And then Dr. Boesak, if you'd like to add to that, that would be terrific.
Dr. Boesak was the person who introduced me to this idea, and I understood it after he explained to me. We do not have people who are less fortunate or unfortunate. We have people who are deliberately targeted. We have them deprived. They have been denied the benefits that they are entitled to receive as children of God. They are being denied the benefits of being neighbors. They are being denied the love that comes from having unconditional love and justice. If they are hungry because other people are deliberately both overpaid and deliberately depriving them. the largesse of our coffers. We have food stores that are bursting. We refuse to feed them. We have vacant properties that are open and we refuse to house. We have money that could be used to retire debt. We use it to build bombs. And this is not an accident. This is not something that we go, oops. No, this is a result of people having, as Micah said, laid awake on their beds at night and envision how they are going to order the world. And the consequences of those decisions are that we have poor, sick, hungry, weak, dying people. It's not unfortunate. They are targeted. It is criminal. And I thank Dr. Boesak for sharing that with me. And as I began to understand, I began, wait a minute. We should change our vocabulary. We should not speak of them as underprivileged. They are deprived. We should not think of them as being less fortunate. They have been robbed. And they are the people who have been raped, ravaged, robbed, murdered, and that it is done in the name of so-called good government or good religion makes it all the more abominable.
Dr. Boesak?
That language we discovered here, Cliff, in the early 1980s. And so we were in the middle of I can honestly say probably the most violent and the most repressive situation in our struggle against apartheid since 1948. And so my church was then battling with the fact that you have the situation of a government, a white supremacist minority government that prides itself on the fact that it's a Christian government. The South African apartheid constitution began with the words calling upon Almighty God and God's wisdom, who have placed us here at this point, southern point in Africa, not saying, of course, that it's not God that placed them. This is land that they invaded, and this is land that they had stolen. And they make that claim after the genocide of the indigenous people. And so by then, of course, now the white people who were privileged through apartheid talked about us as if they have to do something good toward us. And so these are unfortunate people left behind by history. And first, we could not develop as quickly as they could. And so this whole debate about privileged people and unprivileged people, or lazy people. People are poor because they're lazy. The United States knows that argument. People are poor because they don't make use of the opportunities that are there. Without saying honestly that those opportunities have not been equally provided for everybody, and that if your skin is black, then you don't have the opportunities, or if you're a woman, you don't have the opportunities, and so you are deliberately cut off. So when we began to write what we quote in the book, a confession for ourselves and for our times, and we call it the Belhar Confession, we were battling with the language. And one of the paragraphs, we wanted to make that clear. In the paragraph that we talked about God as a God of justice. God is all in all justice. And so if you cannot worship God as the God of justice, we don't know which God you're talking about. And in that paragraph and about that language, we decided to make it very clear, like Judge Griffen has just said, people are not poor because they are lazy. People are not poor because they don't understand how development works. People are not unfortunate because some natural catastrophe has hit them and bypassed some others. People are in the position where they are because they have been systematically, and that's the thing, there have been systems designed and built in that kept people poor. That impoverishment is a systemic issue. It's a deliberate political decision. And so the consequences of greed and of racism and of brutalization, those are what make people poor and that keep on impoverishing them. So in that sense, they are not just unlucky, they are not just historically left behind, they have been wronged because they have been robbed, as the judge says, of their rights. And so it's so important that one uses the language that makes very, very clear that you cannot blame God for what you have done to people, or you cannot blame an unfortunate events and unfolding of history that made people what they are. There are always human agencies at work, and that human agency is in the service of what the judges call empire. And so that is what we do. Jesus against the Roman Empire, we against empire today. It's the same battle. And Jesus' love, by the way, that we're talking about is not just a compassionate love. It's not just an unconditional love. I call it a combative love, because Jesus, in standing up against the powers, stands up for the people. And he stands up, John Calvin says, for the rights of God. And that I find another wonderful concept that we have to use more, because God has rights. We don't think of God as one that has rights. We have rights, human rights, but God has rights, says Calvin. So we can talk about that later if we have the time.
I admit that I use the phrase less fortunate probably a lot, and that's one of the consequences, I suppose, of my own unexamined language, and why this particular observation, I think, has meant a lot to me. And I'm also, when I first asked you, Dr. Boesak, about power, and you referred to Jesus's relative powerlessness, and then you talked about the power of his words. And Judge Griffen, I've known you for a long time, and I think on your signature line, one of the quotes you have, is it James Cone, "Writing is how I fight"?
Yes.
And so that speaks to me of the ways in which language has its own type of power, both, I suppose, for good, or also an abuse of power, in my case, of using phrases like less fortunate. So thank you. This is an illuminating conversation, and we'll be right back with more of it in Good Faith Reads.
I'm Mitch Randall, CEO of Good Faith Media, and we're proud to announce a Better Way initiative. A better way. People of faith are too often cast as only narrow-minded and fundamentalist. This image is false, so let's not surrender the truth. A better way. This initiative from Good Faith Media will focus people of faith on giving voice to justice, to inclusion, to love. These values define the faith communities so many of us know. A Better Way initiative from Good Faith Media. Go to goodfaithmedia.org and click on Initiatives. There's more to tell.
Welcome back to Good Faith Reads. Today we're joined remotely by Dr. Allan Boesak and Judge Wendell Griffen, authors of the Good Faith Media book, Parables, Politics, and Prophetic Faith, Hope and Perseverance in Times of Peril. I'm Cliff Vaughn of Good Faith Media. Judge Griffen, could you talk about your writing process? You mentioned a while ago that y'all started writing in 2020, but for people that might be interested in writing a book or writing columns, they often fear, I think, what has been termed writer's block, or maybe if they're thinking about writing with a partner, they would like to do so, but they don't know how that works. And so just talk about your experience, and then we'll go to Dr. Boesak about writing process.
Thank you very much, Cliff. The process that I used was really spurred by Dr. Boesak, who challenged me to understand that I was already writing. He said, "You're already writing stuff every week. You write sermons. I preach from a manuscript, and you write sermons that have book-like content in them, and you just need to expand on what you're already doing." And so from that process, as I was in 2020 writing sermons about racial reparations in the wake of the George Floyd situation. The first two chapters that I contributed to the book came from sermons that I had written about the George Floyd situation, or in the aftermath of the George Floyd situation, concerning racial reparations. And then it was just collaboration with Dr. Boesak, because we shared each other's content. We bounced things off each other. We were open to comments from each other. And I must tell you, Dr. Boesak, although a benevolent mentor, is a very, very rigorous critic.
Dr. Boesak, do you want to defend yourself or add to?
No, I'm not so much a rigorous critic, but I sometimes think the judge thinks, oh, it's just a sermon. And so he sends it to me, or I listen to it on YouTube, especially during the COVID time when it was difficult to come together in the churches. And I think, why do you keep on saying to me, no, I don't think I'm a writer, because I know you are. And I know he can put things very concisely. And that's where he's much better than I am. My children always say to me, Dad, why do you have to use 500 words when 50 words would do? So, but the judge can write a blog and say so much in that blog. And as I read it, because that's the way my mind works, I see things unfolding and say, oh, you can go there with this argument, you can go there with that argument. That is so brilliant, but dig a little deeper. So it's not so much a critic as just somebody who gets excited by what I see he is saying and writing. And I think that's brilliant. I haven't thought about that. And so if you develop that, where would that go? And when we talk about it, then of course it's a question of where would the two of us go with that thought? And that is so that's really part of a writing process. I have edited one or two books, but I've only co-wrote one with another friend of mine. And that's way back in 2012. And every other book I've written on my own. And so it takes a little bit of adjustment, but friendship helps tremendously. The fact that we think so much together on these issues, we are on the same page, we can complement each other, we can critique one another. And he can tell me, no, what you're saying there makes sense for you, but if you think from a legal point of view, think about this. So it's, and when we began to talk, I mean, he had forgotten, there's a piece here in the book about the unjust judge. And he was writing something, and I said, you know what? You should go back to that thing. And he had forgotten that he had preached that sermon. But that sermon had made such an impression on me that I told him, you have it, I don't, but you will find it, because he's a much more systematic mind than I am. Being a lawyer, maybe, and all of that. I'm just a rambling creature. So he...
Forgive him, God. Forgive him, God. Forgive him.
No, but seriously, so I reminded him of a sermon, and look what he did with that sermon in that book. And so it's that kind of gelling of thoughts, of coming together, of knowing how to support one another, how to make one another think deeper, and go a little bit deeper, and then the end product is something very, very gratifying to read, I think. So but it helps. It helps. If your cooperation is based on a real deep friendship and a shared commitment and solidarity to the things that we think really matter in life.
This question just occurred to me as you were talking about friendship and writing and the things that one of you might have remembered about the other one. But I'm curious, was there a theological point, political observation that you both saw differently that you can think of? Maybe not entirely differently, but just some nuance, perhaps?
It wasn't differently, Cliff. In the introduction, as readers read introduction, readers will glean that Dr. Boesak wrote about the comments of Simon Clovenley and linked that to issues with the Ukrainian war. And we had talked about that, and I had thought about that, but I will admit that Dr. Boesak's exposition of it raised my thinking to a level that I would not have been able to have achieved but for his insight. And he made it so, as Dr. J. Alfred Smith says so beautifully, he made it so plain that I was not only struck by it, but I was glad that that was part of the introduction to our book, because the war in Ukraine at the time that we were having the conversation was at the top of everyone's conversation, just like the war in Gaza now. In 2004 is at the top. The war in Ukraine was at the top of our conversation at that time, but people were not thinking of it in a moral or theological or any kind of expository kind of way. They just thought of it as geopolitics, and did not see it as a commentary on the ways of empire and how imperial religion had sacralized the geopolitics of the world. So we were blind to our own U.S. narcissism, and we were also blind to the flaws in the Ukrainian conflict. Nobody was thinking about the fact that people were in Ukraine were expelling Africans from the Ukraine in the same way that Israel is expelling Palestinians from Gaza. And if we were thinking about Ukraine now, what was going on in Ukraine, if I may say so, in 2022, when we were having the conversation at that time, was essentially an invasion. And what is going on in Gaza is an invasion. But we were realizing, wait a minute, the invasion in Ukraine is the same thing that has been going on in Palestine for 70 years. And the world is up in arms about it. But nobody cares about what happens in Palestine.
Your comments, Judge, incorporating Ukraine, Palestine, Gaza, Israel, speaks to the ways in which the book is really global in orientation. And our planet's nation states are well represented. You've mentioned several already: the United States, South Africa, Ukraine, Syria, Haiti, the list goes on. I'm curious, we'll start with you, Judge, and then go to Dr. Boesak. What are your sources of news and information? Obviously, you read widely, but I think listeners might be curious to learn some of your go-to authors or outlets.
Well, I'll start with what I don't read or what I don't trust. I do not trust U.S. corporate media. I do not trust CNN, MSNBC. I do not trust them. I have found them to be not only untrustworthy, but more importantly, I have found them to be deliberately fraudulent. For instance, I could not get an accurate description of what was going on in Ukraine by simply listening to MSNBC. I had to read Al Jazeera. I had to read The Guardian. I had to read stuff from outside the U.S. because the Noam Chomsky used the term manufactured consent. And I found that the manufactured consent, and Dr. Boesak writes about that in his book, Selfless Revolutionaries, the manufactured consent enterprise is the operation of the U.S. media. And I read Guardian, I read Al Jazeera, I read Chris Hedges, I read Noam Chomsky, I read commentators whose views are global as opposed to nationalistic.
I lived in the US for 5 years and then for another year on and off. And I must say, though, even though I have known this before, and even though I have read Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufactured Consent, that was a breakthrough book for me, wherein they clearly spell out just how much the mainstream media in the United States, and we have come to understand across the world, especially now that media is so global, is no more than a propaganda tool of those elites who rule a specific country or who try to rule the world. So it's only one voice that comes across. Everything else is marginal or marginalized or not taken into account, or they never let the people speak for themselves. They have always some person representing the mass media who then talks on behalf of people, and he gives their own view of what the situation is like. And so for me, it struck me how frightening it is to be in the US and to have that barrage of propaganda hour after hour after hour. I used to joke with my students, and I used to say to them, don't listen to the news tonight, because I can guarantee you that after you listen to the news, you'll know less about what's going on in the world than you did before. So, of course, that's a challenging thing, and that gives rise to all sorts of interesting conversation in the classroom. But the other thing I want to say, Cliff, is that some of the most astute analysts I know of in the world, and I read as widely as I can, and critics of American imperialist policy across the world are in the United States. But it strikes me how they themselves have been marginalized. They are voices that are not heard. You have to go dig for them. One of the most serious and let me say calm expositors of the situation in the world is a man called Jeffrey Sachs. Now, I mean, he's in New York City. He teaches at Columbia. He is one of the most respected intellectuals in the world. He advises the UN. If people had just listened to him, and he explained where the war in Ukraine comes from, that it did not start in 2022 with the invasion of Russia, that it started way back in the 1990s when George Bush and Gorbachev came to an understanding that the Warsaw Pact will be ended, that NATO will not expand, that they signed this agreement, and that the US ripped up that agreement. And that Clinton built on that, and despite all, all of the advice that he got from wise people, they just went on. And that is what got us where we are today. Now, that's Jeffrey Sachs. That's Mearsheimer. That's another intellectual in the United States. People who are not anti-American ranting around the world, but who are calmly and intellectually explaining to you. Chris Hedges' book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Oh, my goodness. I mean, if Christians read that book, and if they understand what he is saying as a war correspondent who speaks Arabic and who's been there for 12 years in the Middle East, and if they just listen to him, it's from an American writer that I got this wonderful thought that they say, look, Islam and Judaism and Christianity, that's not our God. Our God, he says, is violence. Because if the first thing you turn to, it's Walter Wink. Walter Wink said, if the first thing you turn to when you are in trouble, and the last thing you think of as a solution for your trouble is violence, then violence is your God. It's not the God of Jesus. It's not the God of Judaism, and it's not Allah. So you got to be thinking, what does that mean? So for me, and I like the judge, I do not trust the mass media even here. So I look for those marginalized, and especially these days, those younger new voices on the internet who bring marvelous understanding of things and a new kind of thinking about issues than even the older generation does, because they think new. And do you think how 5 years ago people thought of Israel and Palestine, and how this year people think about Palestine and Israel? And we had last Saturday that global day of solidarity, and the millions of people, that's to a large extent because there are younger people who have seen things, who have experienced things, and who are interpreting things in their own way. And I listen to them very, very closely. And so apart from reading theology, and apart from reading the Bible with a view as to what really the Bible is saying to us today, and you got to have a love for the Bible to really do that. And I do have that. And so the Bible speaks to me. I will say to people, the Bible is the most revolutionary book on earth. It is also the most dangerous book on earth. And so you cannot read the Bible if you're not on your knees to say to the Holy Spirit, please let me see what is God really saying to us in this word that is given. So all of that together, I think, has always been my companions in trying to write something.
Cliff, I can't pass this up without, based on what Dr. Boesak said, referring to two other things. Books are important, and people no longer want to read books. They want 248 characters on tweets and TikTok, or they want sound bites. But people cannot properly understand the Israeli-Palestinian issue based on a soundbite. And so Jimmy Carter's Palestine, Not Apartheid, written by a Christian, written by a politician, written by someone who has thought hard and long, not only about the geopolitical issues, but also about the scriptural references, and been to the region and had to live with not only the realities, but also the mistakes. And so to read that, I hold in my hand a book written by Cornel West that I quote in our book. It is titled Cornel West, Democracy Matters, Winning the Battle Against Imperialism. It was written in 2004, 20 years ago. And what Cornel West says about Christian fundamentalism and free market fundamentalism and capitalism is as prescient and relevant now as it was then. It is more relevant. I have in my back, I have the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., not just the I Have a Dream speech, or the I've Been to the Mountains speech, which are the only two speeches that politicians say, and the only two speeches that news media want to show sound bites about. But King wrote so much and spoke so much. The United States Supreme Court basically just now gutted affirmative action. People don't know that Martin Luther King was talking about affirmative action for all people, and did so in a Playboy magazine interview in 1963. And so this has to be part of what we are doing. Now, the last thing I'll say is, it is one thing for the average person not to know this, but it is a terrible thing for preachers not to do this. Because Gardner Taylor said something I never will forget. He says, if the only thing we have is our integrity, and preachers are given the benefit of our congregations of time to study and time to delve. And if we do not take that time to dig deep and search hard, then what we will do when we stand up is basically be parrots of our people's prejudices, as opposed to discerning the will of God based upon the sacred truths we have in the Bible. I cannot say this enough. It is not enough for us to simply have a Bible school knowledge. Theology is a whole lot more than a glorified Sunday school class. And the work of doing theology and the work of doing Christian ethics is a whole lot more than basically having a soundbite for basically an MSNBC or a Fox News or a Christianity Today commentary. We have to be able to have a sense for the signs of our times. And unfortunately, if we are only reading or speaking to get a soundbite in, or parroting sound bites we've heard, we do a disservice not only to the God and the Bible, we do a disservice to the people who are depending on us for some enlightenment and discernment.
An important note to all of our listeners, we at Good Faith Media are always accepting book proposals. Our authors engage with an experienced team of editors, designers, and marketers to produce and sell books on a variety of topics. If you have a book proposal you'd like to run by us, head over to goodfaithmedia.org/bookstore for more information. Dr. Boesak, I wonder if you might read for us a sentence or two from the book that you think is critical for listeners to hear, either because it's representative of the book or because you think it's especially important for folks to hear right now. And then you can comment on it afterwards, and then Judge Griffen will do the same for you.
Yeah, sure. I'm looking at chapter 9, which is a chapter that I have written under the title, Only Don't Go Too Far Away. And that comes from the book of Exodus, and that long stretch where Moses tries to negotiate with Pharaoh. I make the argument that when Moses got his calling from God, all God told him was to go to Pharaoh and to say to Pharaoh only 4 little words: let my people go. That's it. God will do the rest. And so I asked the question, how come 4 little words get stretched into thousands of words, into 12 chapters before we get to the liberation from it? And it's because the politics of Moses was not the politics of God. The politics of Moses was the politics of the palace, the politics of listening to what Pharaoh says and then trying to respond to Pharaoh instead of saying to Pharaoh what God has said. And so it's a chapter that I think a lot of people will find very interesting, because I lean very much on our negotiations with our Pharaoh. And then, of course, the key thing that right in the middle of the negotiations, when the plagues are already there and the pestilence and the flies and so on, then Pharaoh says, okay, you can go, only don't go too far away. And for me, that is symbolic of what has happened with us. The empires of the world have come, they have invaded Africa, they have exploited Africa like they still do today. And these all so-called independence movements that we have had in our own 1994 moment was all Pharaoh was saying to us, okay, you can go because I can't hold on to you any longer because it makes me look too bad in the eyes of the world. And I can't hold you back because you keep on fighting me. So you can go, but only so far so that I can still control you. Now, at the end of that chapter, I say that the narrative of the Exodus and the Pharaoh trying to exert his control and trying to say to you, you can go only so far, but you will still be dependent on what I say. That struggle is still going on. And I say this is a parable of struggle and strife, of oppression and suppression, of rising up and marching on, of the righting of the wrongs, of the last who shall be first. The powerless shall be empowered, the weak shall be girded with strength, the hopeless shall find new hope, and those with might shall not prevail. For it is not Moses, but Miriam, with tambourine in her hand, who first sings the song of praise and freedom. I'm talking about Exodus 15, what we call the Song of Moses. It really is a song of Miriam, dancing before the Lord, leading the whole crowd of women and men, Israelites and all those other slaves who toiled and suffered with them and have now been freed with them. And then I quote Exodus 15, and then I end, there is still so much to fight for, but there is still so much to look forward to. So I think in all of the struggles, and remember, Cliff, we're talking about global struggles. And so when I write about South African struggles, I think about the struggles of African Americans in the United States. I think about the struggles of Native Americans. I think about the struggles of poor people in Latin America. I'm thinking about the struggles of people in Palestine. And so we all have our specific Pharaoh to face. And in our case, I've even made the case in another book that I say, well, we fought one Pharaoh, we got across the Red Sea, and now we're finding we have to fight another Pharaoh, only that Pharaoh looks exactly like us. Booms, new dilemma. So I'm thinking it's a book about struggle. It's a book about pain. It's a book about suffering. It's a book about rising up against injustice. But it is a book about hope that is indistinguishable. And because I believe in it, Wendell Griffen believes in it so clearly, I think people can almost feel that if you struggle with the book, you will come out on the side of hope. And you can see that this is never in vain. There was a guy from Denmark who was killed by the Nazis because he fought against them. And he said to his congregation, you must never say that the struggle that you have been engaged in for justice is in vain, because the moment you say that, it is always the devil who wins. And I think people understand in that book. That's what we're trying to say.
Thank you, Dr. Boesak. Judge Griffen, a favorite or critical passage?
In chapter 10, I wrote about a chapter 10 titled Missing Micaiah on prophetic integrity about Haiti. And I mentioned in chapter 10, where are congregations hearing about the deliberate unconcern for Haiti? The question Jehoshaphat asked Ahab applies, is there no other prophet of the Lord here of whom we may inquire? Is the spirit of Micaiah lost concerning God's Haitian people? How is it that day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and decade after decade, prophetic truth-telling has not been done by pastors, religious educators, religious authors, and the mission entities of faith groups? Have we become court prophets to the interests of U.S. and French imperialism, white supremacy, and indifference about suffering descendants of enslaved Africans? If so, why? What spell has been cast over us? What sums have been paid to purchase our silence or willful indifference? And then I wrote that people who are up in arms about the plight of Ukrainian men, women, and children freezing, starving, and being raped, robbed, murdered, and otherwise traumatized by war have not given Haitians a thought, as that society is threatened by cholera, has suffered 2 devastating earthquakes, and reels from successive episodes of political upheavals. I mentioned that Haiti is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere when it was at one time the richest French colony. And I mentioned that we don't hear U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock, pastor of the congregation that Martin Luther King Jr. pastored, talking about Haiti. We don't hear talking about Haiti from church mission groups that send mission groups to Haiti. We don't hear Haiti mentioned as even a meeting agenda item on the denominational subjects of our annual or quadrennial meetings. How is it that we can talk about the person who does not get out of bed when a neighbor is knocking because they have no bread, but we can be so unconcerned about a nation in our own time zone and in our own hemisphere that has the oldest effort at democracy and the oldest history of having fought against a European empire and won a battle for its independence after the United States. And so I think about that because it is a telling statement about the prophetic incompetence and prophetic malpractice and lack of discernment that passes for Christian education and Christian evangelism and Christian missions. We have to realize that what we are celebrating as our Christian heritage oftentimes is the celebration of our own notions of heresy.
The book is Parables, Politics, and Prophetic Faith, Hope and Perseverance in Times of Perils. It's written by our 2 guests today, Dr. Allan Boesak and Judge Wendell Griffen. The book is available at goodfaithmedia.org/bookstore. Dr. Boesak, Judge Griffen, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Cliff.
Excellent conversation. Thank you.
Indeed.